Hello, everyone. This is Rasul Chaudhary. I am the founder and executive director of MIJ, and I run a youth-led organization with people from around the globe, especially 9 countries, including Seychelles, Bangladesh, Mauritius, UK, Canada, Ghana, and Malaysia. And we work on developing legal and policy discourse around the world, discussing innovations in the fields of social justice. Along with me, we have Ahmed Hassan, who is a barrister at law and also a research assistant at the Center for Peace and Justice in Dhaka. And of course, our guest speaker for today is Nick Ryder. He's a professor at the University of West of England, Bristol, and he, of course, specializes in financial crimes and money laundering as a subject. So on to you.
Hi, thank you, Rafa, for passing on the baton, per se. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to interview and speak to Professor Ryder today. For most of our colleagues here at Mazeltov, and for anyone who's viewing this, what's fun about this interview for me in particular is that I had the privilege of being Professor Ryder's student back in 2016 on the financial crime module, which was when I got into discussing financial crime to start off with. And it was one of the earliest papers that I ever wrote, earliest op-eds that ever got published. And I mean, a lot of that credit kind of goes to being in Professor Ryder's class. So Nick, Professor Ryder, thank you for joining us. And it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today?
Yeah, very good. And thank you for the very kind introduction. It's great to speak to you both again. And hopefully I won't bore you all for the next 15 minutes, half an hour.
I mean, given from what I remember in your classes, it's near about impossible. If you couldn't bore us in a class, you probably wouldn't bore us now.
I think the relationship goes two ways. I think students play a really important part in contributing to class. And I think that with financial crime, it's never out of the news. And virtually all of the stories are quite shocking, and in relation to money laundering and so on. So I think that the students play a big part in making teaching a really important part of the job, and you need that two-way interaction. Otherwise, the class becomes a little bit stale and a bit boring. So without the students, the class doesn't work.
Fair enough. But I mean, that's you, and you're speaking about how you functioned as a teacher. Before we move into that segment of your life, we would love to know a little bit more about yourself, about your days at Glamorgan as an LLB student, then as your days as an LLM student at Bristol. What was it like?
A lot different to the sort of how things are. I think when I started my law degree, I had a misconception. I wanted to be a lawyer and, wanted to save the world and take all the, I suppose, bad people down, if you like. And that was me being quite naive at the time. And I think during my degree, I tended to enjoy the research element of it. And I finished my degree in 1996, and you then weigh up what options to take post-degree. And I think at the time, I maybe incorrectly went down the professional route. It's not for everybody, it just wasn't for me. So I did the LPC at Bristol University and loved the city, loved the university, as I enjoyed my time at the University of Glamorgan. And I very much felt that it was, small boy going to big city. And it took a while to adapt to, not being at home at least once or twice a month. And one thing that the LPC did teach me was how to research. So this is pre-Westlaw, pre-LexisNexis, pre-Hein, when you had to go in the library and, blow the dust off the books. And that, for me, using Halsby's laws and Halsby's statics was an eye-opener. And that's the part of the LPC I enjoyed. To be honest, I struggled with it. It was very tough. And I struggled not writing in an academic manner. And I think from writing wills for clients or fictitious clients or writing draft letters or setting up a company, for me, it was a bit, to be honest, it was a bit bland and a bit boring. That's nothing against the course. That's purely my interpretation of it. So I did it the hard way in terms of doing it. Maybe with hindsight, I should have done an LLM first, but you learn from these mistakes. But I did learn how to research properly, and I think that probably stuck with me for the last 20 years, I suppose.
But
Well, that's actually amazing that you still are very much interested in what you're doing, unlike most of young people who like question their choices. So,
I mean, I think it's absolutely normal for anyone to question their choices at some point, right? I mean, to be fair, I've had the exact same scare as Nick has had. I spent a year in practice and then decided it wasn't for me. But so you mentioned going back to, doing your LPC at Bristol. What was that like, apart from obviously what you've just discussed? What was the student life like in Bristol back then?
It was absolutely amazing. The Forest is a very small town, and it was a very close-knit group of students that we studied with and made some good friends. But Bristol, I think in terms of the city, I remember driving up with my parents to look for accommodation, and we randomly met 4 housemates just on the day. And I think the LPC lasted 9-10 months, and I stayed on for 3 more months in the house until the following August, because it's loved the city. Nightlife and that sort of being a student again was entertaining. I think I'm a little old for that sort of level of partying now. Not that I could party anyway, but socialising, it was a real year of discovery. Isn't the right? It's a badly phrased term, but I think for me it was just growing up a little bit, becoming a bit more thick-skinned, a little bit more experienced, maybe a little bit savvier in terms of future career choices. But yeah, a great house in Redlands, and you can't beat living in Bristol when there's 51 pubs in a 1 mile radius. It was a sort of a postgraduate's blessing in many ways. It affected my studies, and sometimes it's tough to get the balance right. But yeah, it was on reflection, it was a lovely city to work in, and it was great to live in for 15 months as well.
51 pubs in a 1 mile radius. I can imagine pub crawls were quite the nightmare.
They were, yeah. They became a weekly treat, I suppose. And yeah, it was, my studies were affected on maybe perhaps a little too much. And yeah, making class at 9 o'clock the next morning but I think we managed it on most occasions.
Fair enough. And then you went on to do your PhD at Glamorgan again. So tell us a bit more about that. What was it like? What made you make that decision to jump onto doing a PhD?
It was luck. It was right place, right time. I didn't really know what I wanted to do after the LPC. And I managed to pick up an 8-week placement in the student office in the law school at the University of Glamorgan as an admissions advisor. So essentially through clearing, we take calls from students, and with that 8-week placement, I remember speaking to one of my former tutors, Professor Gerwin Griffiths and Professor Margaret Griffiths, and he mentioned to me the possibility of a PhD. And I didn't really know what that was or what it entailed. There's a part of me that still doesn't know 20 years on what it entails. But that's how the conversation started. So we discussed some basic ideas. I didn't really have a particular expertise or area that I enjoyed at the time. And the initial plan was, well, we'll give Nick some teaching in the first semester and see how that progresses. And then post sort of, I want to say, run about January 98, after the first semester teaching, and the feedback was positive. It was very nerve-wracking when you go into a class of 23 years old, and your class are all property managers and estate agents, and you're teaching them land law. So all the topics to give somebody new was land law, and it's a great topic, but it's just not for me. So it was a real steep learning curve. And because the feedback was quite good, I was offered a 3-year scholarship. Again, right place, right time, fate, whatever you want to call it, but it really was a great learning curve. And I think for anybody that wants to get into academia, normally it'll be degree, postgraduate qualification, PhD, if you want to go into it in the traditional manner. And you might pick up maybe 2 or 3 or 4 hours teaching a week. But for me, it was 8 hours from week 1. And it was, hard graft, but you pick up things quite quickly. I was very supported by some great colleagues at the law school at the time. So for me, it was a real good learning curve about not how to deliver things, but I think how to engage with students. That's really important to me. And if I can make landlord interesting, I think looking at other topics than it was. So that's how I got into the doctorate route. And in terms of the topic, well, it was credit unions and cooperatives, which I knew. I studied consumer law as part of my degree, but I knew nothing about credit unions. So it was right. Let's have a look at these things and see what we can do. So that's how I fell into the doctorate in 97 to 98.
So one of the things that you mentioned was helpful, like a very strong support group, and the fact that you had teachers who you could fall onto with regards to the advices. That's really important in academic career, having the right path laid out for you or someone who can give you direction. So what were the gruesome challenges you had to face entering into the academic side, even with regards to like teaching students? Because of course, you said you were 23 years old and they were all like managers and professional people.
I think the most difficult thing that I found was an inability to say no, because I was paid on an hourly rate, as many academics start to become an associate lecturer or a visiting lecturer. For my first semester in Glamorgan, it was initially 4 hours a week. So that was manageable. I was on, I was at £25 an hour, which at the time was like, wow, this is, I can pay my rent and so on. But it was an inability to say no. And the more and more teaching came up, the hours increased. So roughly by about the Christmas time, I was maybe on 16, 17 hours a week. And when you cast across, I know those academic colleagues will recognize this, when you're delivering 6 or 7 different topics, it's then quite difficult to really identify what a speciality is. And yeah, I taught, for example, health and safety at work law, environmental law, equity and trusts, introduction to business law, introduction to company law, insolvency law. So it really was a steep learning curve for that initial 6 months. So I think for me, that was one of the major difficulties, was trying to work on the doctorate and trying to obviously earn a living. And then the scholarship made a big difference for that. And so the scholarship kicked in about the January of 1998. And I then, within that, began to look into the teaching in a little bit more detail. And then a colleague left the university and I was asked to cover public law, a compulsory first year topic with 160 students, and I was given a week's notice. So for that last 8 to 10 weeks of the second semester was really hard work, but rewarding, because I then picked up a core module. And to give advice to anybody that wants to get into academia, if you can deliver an option and a core in terms of the essential desirables for a job application, so by luck, a member of staff left. I was then able to step into the team, and the feedback was good. So it was pretty much learning the topic on a weekend, giving that class the following Thursday, and then repeating that for 8 to 9 weeks. Not ideal, but I think things are a little bit different now in terms of support mechanisms. But yeah, so I think in terms of the initial difficulty, it was managing teaching time with research time.
I mean, that is incredible though, to have gone and taught that many number of modules. The prep time must have been insane.
Yeah, it was tough, but I think that graft and hard work, I think is really important. I don't think there's any way I can explain it apart really from just knuckling down for those weekends with Hilaire Barnett's Constitutional Law book, reading up on some of the stuff. I did A-level politics, so I enjoyed that sort of prime ministerial powers, and at the time you were going through the new Blair government, so that was really popular with the students, and devolution. Judicial review I didn't like at all. That was really just to get your head around, GCHQ and the ultra vires principles, and 20 years on, I'm still struggling to understand that. So,
Judicial review is fun. Come on, Professor Ryder.
I have no doubt it's a fun topic, but when you're 23 years old and it's last week of term and you've got students asking you what's on the exam paper, it is a very important topic, but I think I couldn't do it. The sort of the 2-week prep time I had really, and I think probably was one of my not my finest lectures, but
But you came out of that, and with obviously what has been a massive wealth of experience, taking that forward into your career. A couple of questions obviously come into mind. Was the PhD the official segue into you looking at financial crime more deeply, or was that something you targeted ahead of time?
It was neither of those. Sorry, the doctorate was on credit unions, and credit unions are a financial cooperative. Obviously, different parts of the world have different banking structure. So cooperatives are a really important part. They're owned by members, and my thesis was an investigation of why credit unions have not become successful in the UK. And if you compared them with other nation states like Canada, America, the Republic of Ireland, the market penetration in the UK was less than 1% at the time. So what I was trying to do was to draw parallels between more mature, more developed movements of credit unions, and America and the Republic of Ireland were perfect examples. So by comparing the two, what we ended up sort of identifying were sort of models of development and how policies can help, and how a flexible legal framework. So the PhD involved a nice visit to Ireland on a few occasions with a good friend of mine. I've not seen her for a long time. Olive McCarthy at the University of Cork was very helpful because she's an expert in credit unions. So for me, it was very much consumer law based, and that's where I begin to get maybe a little enjoyment with financial regulation. So really, that probably spawned a financial services law module at the University of Glamorgan, which I delivered in the third year of the law degree, and it just took off. We had about, I think, 90 students in 2003 for my last year at the University of Glamorgan. I think the year before was about 75, 60 maybe. So it became really popular. And within that, we did a financial crime lecture. And on hindsight, that was probably one of the worst lectures I'd ever delivered. Banking regulation, absolutely fine. I talk about BCCI bearings, which a lot of you would be familiar with. But when it came to fraud and money laundering, forget it. It was through over my head. So that was interesting. The feedback was quite critical from the students. They said, Nick, financial crime, not for you. But so you look back and the PhD was really important to me. And in terms of the credit sector, I really enjoyed that research. But I'd always got that little snippet of enjoyment with sort of financial scandals, fraud, money laundering. That sort of evolved then from teaching, not necessarily the PhD.
I mean, so obviously the natural curiosity then rises. What about that financial structure gets you going? I mean, what makes that tick for you?
I think for me, it's the limited accountability. And the more when I came to UB then in 2004, I initially started teaching public law. And then in the second semester, I took over commercial law with Professor James Devaney who's now at Reading University. And that's where I was given a little bit of freedom to introduce more modern contemporary twist on commercial law. So that's where the financial crime part came into it. But in terms to answer your question, I think for me, it's just the limited accountability of large corporations that are involved in financial crime. And there are many, many, many examples. We look back in history on that. And it's just that frustration that there's never anyone held accountable. We can go back to the 2007-8 financial crisis, the savings and loans crisis in America, the Wall Street crash, the LIBOR manipulation. So for me, it was just, found it fascinating within that financial regulation arena and the clear overlap with financial crime. So that sort of led me down that particular sort of money laundering fraud path and sort of early part of my sort of 2004, 5, 6 start at UE.
I mean, from that, from someone telling you that probably financial crime isn't your thing to now being the series founder of relating to financial crime. I mean, how does that journey happen? How do you make it happen?
It's a good question. If I could patent that, I might be rich.
Yeah.
I think the journey from that, and you take feedback importantly, student feedback is really important for you, and because students are a key part of my role in terms of testing research ideas and theory. So part of if you can imagine it is a little bit like an infinity circle, if I can use that, where I've got an idea for teaching, I'll test it with the students, and depending on what reaction I get, I'll then go back, maybe work on a conference presentation, test it there, and then sort of retest that new model of paper within the lecture. So for me, it was the 2007 financial crisis, and I thought, oh, a minute, this is intriguing. Surely there must be a link with financial crime here. And there's actually a dedication in the book to the students who I taught that year for listening to me rant about the financial crisis and the limited form of accountability. So I think for me, it's just a great way to engage with the students with a really contemporary, current topic that we've researched. But to me, teaching, it has to be research informed. You have to give students the real life scenarios about market manipulation, fraud, and ultimately, of course, terrorism financing.
So from what I understand, a lot of your career, therefore, has been driven by your students and your passion for teaching more than anything else. Yeah,
I think it has. And every class is different, every year is different. And I think that's the beauty of it. You might get classes where you might not get a response for the first 10, 15 minutes. But I remember delivering, I think it was the first ever terrorism financing class in UWE, and so before Xbox. And I remember students sitting on the floor and I'm thinking, that's rather unusual. Why have I got a full class and more? And it was the quietest class ever. And we were discussing some very tough points about 9/11 and the financing of it and the response to it. And it was as if I think that penny dropped in terms of terrorism financing was something that clearly people are very, very enthused about, because I think it's probably the topic that no one likes to talk about. We can talk about money laundering, we can talk about fraud and market manipulation, and we can look at COVID and the impact of cybercrime, for example. But terrorism financing, that's the elephant in the room that nobody will talk about. And that sort of partly made me think, right, well, what can I do to make it more easy to understand in terms of researching, and importantly, how can I engage with stakeholders with the research findings as well?
Students are kind of your motive behind doing better research, and the fact that making it easier for them to understand. A lot of people who do the LLM master programs do consider going into academics full-time, but they have a lot of reservations because they think that no career opportunities are good enough as a result of them doing a PhD. So what advice do you think you would give to people who want to go into academics? Is this something, considering the era we are in, technological advancements, the fact that everything is going in that direction, should they pursue academic careers?
It's a really rewarding career. I think that I would not change my career one iota. To me, it's rewarding, it's engaging, it's flexible. I work with some fantastic people, and I've had the privilege of supervising 11 brilliant PhD students to completion. And I've got more students submitting in the summer, and new students starting in September. So I think for me, it is a difficult path. I think I appreciate that it might not be the popular option with students, but my advice is that I think in the last year of a degree, think about a dissertation. I appreciate it's a big task, 11 to 12,000 words, but if there's a particular topic that you enjoy and you can connect with it with a dissertation supervisor, that can then form the foundation of your LLM dissertation, and that can then form the foundation of your doctorate. So I think that, and I appreciate that not dissertation isn't for everybody, and I didn't do a dissertation, but that could be a rewarding way to get into the academic. So I think like blogging, for example, maybe even co-authoring a paper with your dissertation supervisor. That happens on a few occasions. So at least it makes the CV when you're applying for scholarship more appropriate than others who haven't done that. The difficulty, of course, in the current climate is funding, and I appreciate it's very difficult for students to get scholarships, and they are few and far between. But you can do them part-time. A lot of my students do their PhDs on a part-time basis. They work in some, families, mothers, fathers, and hats off to them for doing that. I was very fortunate with my PhD. My wife Ruth was just a rock solid support mechanism, and there were times where I wanted to pack it in because it was hard work. And I think that support structure around you is really important. So I think in terms of doing a doctorate, it is that quest for what is the problem? What's my methodology? And can I maybe not solve the problem, but can I maybe help to tackle that problem? And it's the same, I suppose, as the premise of any master's dissertation or essay question you have. So for me, it is about that pursuit of answers to questions, and then can you deliver impact potentially from those conclusions and recommendations.
So with regards to your incredible career, I wanted to ask, you mentioned the elephant in the room earlier. What is it about terrorism financing that you thought was difficult to bring up in the classroom, or that people found difficult to bring up in the classroom setting?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of the academic attention before 9/11, quite rightly, was for money laundering, frauds, and the link with the illegal distribution of narcotic substances. So as you know, of course, every international provision was money laundering, money laundering, money laundering. 9/11 was a game changer. It's a catalyst for new controversial laws. And I didn't think anybody had really looked at it in significant detail. So if you look at, for example, the very well-termed phrase financial reward terrorism used by George Bush after the terrorist attacks, nobody defined it. And I'm thinking, well, you're freezing assets, you're imposing sanctions on individuals who are suspected terrorists, the rule of law out the window.
Confiscation.
Absolutely, yeah, asset forfeiture. So all of that was a key part. So what I tried to do was try to, think of a working definition of the financial war on terrorism. So that book was published in 2015. And unfortunately, it's been very well received in terms of external reviewers. And I've been able then to expand that research. So it was trying to fill a gap in the literature. And for any aspiring academics, that is really important in terms of your doctorate. If you look at money laundering, everyone's written on it. But can you find that little chink, that little gap maybe where you can exploit that, open up and say, right, I can now solve that problem or maybe address some of the unanswered questions. So with the terrorism financing part, and the more I looked into it, the more I began, for example, to consider, well, how do you tackle terrorism financing in the post 9/11 era? And one of my first papers on terrorism financing in the Journal of Business Law in 2007, and it was called A False Sense of Security, where you've got this plethora of laws, but have they been successful? Now, the British government claimed in 2002, we've frozen 110 million pounds of Taliban assets. Fantastic. But if you read the small print, 95 million was actually frozen before 9/11. So you've got things being put forward, but actually you begin to question it. The more I looked into it, the more I could see weaknesses within the global efforts to tackle terrorism financing, and then more so with the UK. So it was quite interesting to look at the influence of the UN provisions before 9/11, but how they were focused on money laundering. And money laundering is different from terrorism financing, it's diverse. And you're looking for the proceeds of crime, but does that mean terrorists necessarily make a profit? That's not the ultimate goal of a terrorist. The ultimate goal is to commit mayhem and destruction, fear and apprehension. So that sort of influenced me in relation to that particular theme. And, I'm very fortunate. People seem to appreciate the research and engagement with stakeholders, United Nations, NATO, Europol, CEPOL, UK security services. I've been very fortunate to work with some fantastic institutions.
In your book, The Financial War on Terror, you do make a comparison of domestic structures and how they managed to tackle terrorist financing, and international structures and how they managed to tackle terrorist financing. And I remember during actually one of the summatives for your classes back in my LLB days, we did a paper comparing the third EU directive to POCA and the other domestic instruments in the UK. In what we have today, the fifth directive having been brought out very recently, series of other international organizations coming up with their versions of how they want to tackle the problem of terrorist financing. How do you view the development in that area? And to what degree do you think domestic structures flare up against, say, the international structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the international model is flawed. I don't think it's perfect, but I don't think you'll ever prevent acts of terrorism financing. As we've seen in Europe, well, actually, I'll rephrase that, across the world, whether it's from Asia Pacific Rim to Africa, we saw the terrorist attack in Mozambique recently, to the lone wolf actors in terms of Europe, and of course, right-wing terrorist attacks in America. You're never going to get a legal framework which is perfect. So the international community, UN, Financial Action Task Force, EU, are playing catch up. Now, terrorists will always be 4 or 5 steps ahead. But saying that, I think the recommendations are a very good benchmark. I think the financial war on terrorism has been successful on some terrorist groups. I know there's some very good work by Professor Jimmy Carroll from the University of Notre Dame, and he's argued that it has had an impact on Al-Qaeda. But terrorists evolve, their financing methods evolve, and one of my most recent publications, which is not until later this year, has looked at the association between terrorism, financing, and fraud. So the 2018 Mutual Evaluation Report on the Financial Action Task Force praised the UK. We're now ranked #1. And I thought, okay, but I would disagree with that. So the more I investigated this particular terrorism, financing, and fraud association, it's as if terrorism financiers have a little black book of low-level frauds that they will commit to get access to very easy money, which will be unreported, and the police might not necessarily investigate. So with this new paper, we've identified a more extensive and new form of terrorism financing typology, which then led me to investigate in particular, what has the government done to address terrorism financing and fraud? Now, bear in mind, against the backdrop, we're ranked #1 in the world. You know, we are top of the league. We are the champions, according to Financial Action Task Force. You then find a disconnected fraud policy and a terrorism financing policy. Fraud doesn't mention terrorism financing. Terrorism financing doesn't mention fraud. Yet there is so many cases in the UK where people have been convicted for fraud, for terrorism financing cases. And if you look at the US, for example, where the Americans use fraud as a disruptive tool, so they will arrest a suspected terrorist and charge them with fraud offences. So somewhere between 17 and 25% of all US terrorism cases, the person is convicted of fraud. So bear that in mind. In the UK, since 2016, there's been out of 114 terrorism convictions, only 3 are for fraud. 2.9%. So you can see how that paper hopefully will benefit key stakeholders. And yeah, it's been, so it's what I'm not trying to criticise the HM government and Financial Action Task Force, but it's just pointing out that you can rank things X, Y, and Z. But ultimately, there are still going to be loopholes and that disconnected policy between fraud and terrorism financing. And what I find very frustrating is that if you look back at many government publications the last 20 years, what do you think is the most popular funding mechanism used by the IRA? Fraud. And still a disconnected policy completely.
One of my questions is because obviously coming from Pakistan, we're routinely on the fact that we are on the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force and the fact that we need to improve our regulations. What are the factors that affect regulations across a developing country and a developed country? And another question is, do you think the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force are okay, that they're the same for a developed country and a developed country as well? So considering they would ask us to minimize the risk, considering our resources are similar to probably what the UK will have. So do you think that's fair in terms of providing recommendations to a developing country?
I think it's extremely difficult, and I do have a lot of sympathy for countries who are on the grey list. And I think, as we've spoken about it before, I was asked to give a contribute to a webinar in last November or December, I think, in Islamabad, and organised by a think tank. And you could sense that the problems that the grey list poses, and there are some people that would suggest the Financial Action Task Force is a two-tier system. How is it possible for a developed economy maybe not to be on a grey list, but not to be fully compliant with the recommendations? And then for a developing economy such as Pakistan, which I think has introduced 10 to 13 new laws to tackle this in the last 14 months. And of course, the infrastructure. So technology, financing, training, education of law enforcement agencies is going to be of very, and even the financial services sector. And I remember examining a PhD many years ago, and it was all about debit card fraud in Egypt. And of course, these cards are based upon paper. There was no electronic system to actually authorize transactions. So if you've got that within, sort of African continent, the Middle East, you can see how difficult it can be. So I think that the methodology is controversial, and you've seen that with the UK being propelled to the top of the FATF list. And I think it's about open conversations between FATF and developing economies. And that's not to say that maybe some of the recommendations have not been fully implemented, and there are a lot of questions that needed to be asked in certain jurisdictions, I think. I think the UK published an updated sanctions list recently with like 15, 16 countries. I was sending to a colleague this week for his research. So you can see how it is very controversial. And I think, Pakistan's in a very precarious position where they are trying to do the right thing via the new Prime Minister Imran Khan, introducing the new laws, but it's going to take time. And it's about the financial support, it's the training to improve the levels of compliance, but that's not a quick fix. It's going to be time to embed that sort of compliance culture, I think, within developing economies.
Also, a couple of other questions related to, of course, terrorist financing and financial crimes. Is charities used as obviously a front for funds to be moved across countries? And because we faced a lot of issues here as well with where we are not being able to register charities or nonprofit organizations. What do you think how charities or nonprofits should be regulated in a manner where, of course, you can allow them to be registered, but restrict terrorist financing as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think if you look at a lot of the Financial Action Task Force publications and a lot of the academic work on the non-profit sector, then charities are highly susceptible, and we can just look back at how Al-Qaeda was partly financed. I think what's important is that the charity sector must comply with the anti-money laundering or counter-terrorism financing reporting obligations. That's very important. But the charity sector needs a strong regulator. So within the UK, for example, we have the Charities Commission of England and Wales, which is actively involved in attempting to limit the impact of terrorism financing on charities, or rephrase that maybe, on charities being misused as vehicles in terms of financing terrorism. I think part of the problem is training. A lot of volunteers will work for a charity, for example, but it can be very easy to set a fake charity. There are multiple cases in the UK where people have claimed to be claiming money for a particular charity, and they then use that for terrorism purposes. I think we've had a few cases in the UK where 3 individuals were claiming to be for a particular Islamic-based charity, and they weren't. So £23,000 later, luckily, the police were able to prevent that terrorist attack. But that does not mean that it can't apply to other charities. But yeah, it's a very at-risk sector, and I think people can be misled by the aims of a charity. I think the Times reported many years ago that following a natural disaster, I think there was an earthquake in Pakistan, that a lot of the aid was being delivered to the country in terms of money, but the Taliban, Al-Qaeda were top slicing it at source. But again, this is how Al-Qaeda would operate. And, there are suggestions that Al-Qaeda will misuse the zakat system of local contributions to the mosque on a monthly basis. And the evidence is difficult because there's no paper trail. So, and I think
that
then
makes it
that's,
worse.
yeah, I think so. But also, I think that then gives the wrong impression of zakat and non-remittance systems, because they are such an important part of Islamic faith and culture and history, that I think that this is where the financial war on terrorism was, some would argue, Islamophobic, where after 9/11, everything linked into Islamic finance, it must be a terrorist hotbed. And that's not the case. That is so far from the truth. And we published a paper in 2009 where, we found some rather damning evidence of the US Treasury Department were sanctioning racial profiling of bank customers, which I find repulsive. But under US law, it's legal to do that. But that again is wrong, because a terrorist is a terrorist. You've got Timothy McVeigh, a right-wing terrorist. You've got the assassination of Joe Cox, the MP, by a right-wing terrorist. You've got the attack of the Capitol Hill in Washington, right-wing extremist groups.
I mean, something that seems to kind of stand out, and I don't know if I'm making a mistake here, forgive me if I am, but there seems to be a connection between liquidity and the probable impact of financial crimes in terms of how it funds terrorism. Is that something that we see as being like a common thread across systems everywhere? The more liquid a structure, the easier it is to move money around.
Yeah, and I think the prime example of that is Islamic State of Iraq and Levante, ISIS. I was part of a 3-year funded project for the ESRC between 2015 and 2018, and a major part of that project was to identify the funding streams of ISIS, and then to assess whether or not the legal provisions are able to prevent that. What we found is that the ISIS funding model is hierarchical. It's based on a corporate structure. And that's quite scary. So it's as if they've learned from how the IRA were financed. So ISIS would publish its own, for example, annual budget. It would publish its own propaganda. It would do calls on social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, so on, to actually get financing on Facebook. So it took terrorism financing to a new uncharted level. And it got to a point where ISIS even had its own currency. Now, the Al-Qaeda model between 2001 and 2010 was very effective, but ISIS took that to the next level. So what ISIS were doing, based upon our research, they were learning from the mistakes made by Al-Qaeda. And what we're now finding is that, obviously, with the demise of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq, you have to consider what is the new funding model. And the new funding model could be low-scale, low-capability weapons. But you can't tell me that ISIS aren't working with Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other groups in terms of a common funding model. So it's intriguing that ISIS learned from how the IRA were financed, and then learned from the mistakes of Al-Qaeda and how they were financed. The financial war on terrorism hasn't finished. It's an ongoing process, and terrorists will learn to evolve. Think about how many people can access a mobile phone, a tablet, a laptop, and can access a social media platform, or can contact people via an encrypted message, and they can stream terrorist attacks live on Facebook, which we saw in Christchurch in New Zealand, and we saw in California in 2017 in San Bernardino. So there needs to be a multi-agency joined-up approach, I think.
So like you've said that, of course, now they're even using social media, they're using tech-based mediums to obviously fund terrorism. And one of the things that are very, very much prevalent is, of course, the virtual currencies that are Bitcoins and everything else that obviously are used to fund terrorist activities. In your opinion, because we just recently got the Fifth Money Laundering Directive, and do you think that the regulation is sufficient to supervise crypto assets and cryptocurrencies with regards to terrorist financing, or it still requires a little bit more improvement?
I think it's very much in its infancy. We've got 5 MLD. We now have, since Jan 2020, the FCA regulating cryptocurrency providers, but their response has been, Dr. Henry Hillman's written a very good blog, which you can access on the EWE website, and I'd encourage all of you to read that. And he's quite critical of what the FCA has done. I think from my perspective, the problem lies at central government. So for instance, wrote a paper last December, Journal of Business Law, and it's intriguing that the NCA don't see crypto assets as a threat, but the FCA see them as a threat. So that begs the question to me, are they not working together, or is there information the FCA has that they haven't exchanged with the NCA? And the exchange of information is a significant problem and weakness within this current government in relation to tackling terrorism, financing, and money laundering in particular.
Interesting. I mean, I'm given to believe also that there are different countries obviously view this very differently. Like cryptocurrencies and the possession of cryptocurrencies has led to recent arrests here in Bangladesh. And I can imagine that this is similar in very many different countries where they're going to view this either as a threat or a non-threat. What do you think? Do you think that's the right approach, looking at in that binary format?
I think it's difficult. I think different nation states have a different culture to forms of investment and high-risk banking. I know some countries have attempted to ban cryptocurrencies, virtual assets, if you like, that sort of thing. I don't know what the perfect approach is yet. I think there needs to be some form of regulation. Self-regulation, which the UK did have, doesn't work. Banning it will force it maybe further underground. I think people will be enticed in by the quick profit that they could make from new and emerging cryptocurrencies. I mean, maybe it depends on who appears on Saturday Night Live. I won't mention any names, but in terms of how a celebrity can endorse something, can have a significant impact. But of course, cryptocurrencies in the UK are not part of the compensation scheme. So if I invest in Bitcoin, £20,000, and that collapses, I lose everything. So, but this again is one of my students challenged me on this a few months back. This is the natural evolution of money, and that student's correct. E-money will become, I think, in a COVID, hopefully, things will get better, and we can get a resemblance of normality. But I think in terms of e-money, this is the natural evolution. It's inevitable that we'll pay more on our phones, our tablets, our Apple Watches, whatever device you've got. So I think it's the natural evolution of money. How we regulate that, I think, is at this stage is a difficult question to answer.
This is my last question, Professor Ryder, is because you said COVID. What impact do you think COVID-19 had on financial crimes and money laundering all around the world?
I think what we have seen is financial criminals have gone more online. There's more. I'm getting more phishing emails on a regular basis. I had 3 last night. The usual "Dear Sir, Madam, I work for the immigration control system in America. I've got 7.5." Yeah, you get it. You get the gist of that. But I'm also getting text messages, very sophisticated ones. I think one, the lockdown was, you've qualified for a tax rebate under COVID. No, I haven't. I get a lot of spam regarding self-assessment taxes. And they're becoming more and more sophisticated. But the important thing is education, and people have to understand, if you've won the Yahoo lottery, you haven't won the Yahoo lottery. Or if somebody wants, and that has a threat. And I think what is particularly worrying is that you see that how financially struggling people are going to be duped into these quick fix schemes. And they might be simply Ponzi or a boiler room fraud. So I think what we have seen is financial criminals have had to alter their sort of their methodology. But they haven't gone away. We've got, the furlough scheme in the UK, which has been very productive in terms of keeping people's jobs, but they reckon that, the National Audit Office published a report last November that £26.3 billion of that is through fraud. So it'd be intriguing to see how much of that was through fraud or prosecutions and arrests. So I think, if anything, the pandemic has again highlighted the threat posed by maybe more of the cybercrime, perhaps, than sort of maybe your insider fraud in terms of in a shop or working for a company.
Thank you.
So I think in terms of what we're looking at in that post-COVID era, how things are moving more online, one, because of convenience, and B, because of necessity.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, we're then having to deal with regulations that would have to encompass all of these details in order to make successful prosecution. I think V.K. Raja pointed it out very carefully when he talks about how money laundering regulations are always in this point between trying to cast a very wide net and trying to cast a very specific articulation of the crimes in order to nail down that prosecution. Do you feel that that's been the problem to identify correctly financial crimes and money laundering problems?
Yeah, I think that's a huge problem. The evidential burden on prosecutors is very high, and which is why we sort of ended up with a rather lackluster, haphazard enforcement strategy in the UK, where we seem to appreciate imposing financial penalties. And they're a nice media-friendly figure. Bank X is fined millions of dollars, but ultimately this becomes part of their trading business, where the bank will set aside, banks, corporations will set aside X amount per year. And if you just look at the HSBC deferred prosecution agreement in America in 2012, where the bank's involved in negligently laundering money for the Russian mafia, drug cartels, and breaching the UN sanctions regime, the DPA is imposed by the US Department of Justice. But why does the then Chancellor George Osborne send a begging letter to the DOJ saying, please don't prosecute HSBC because we've got one of the biggest financial crises in the world? And all these documents are available online in terms of Congress reviews in America. So for me, you have to go for the individual and the company. It's a question of what is the appropriate forum or mechanism to do that. And it'll be intriguing to see what the Law Commission publishes in 14 days' time with their new discussion paper on corporate economic crime. I'm optimistic but cautious. I think we'll end up with failure to prevent, and that will be a key part of my rant at students in corporate economic crime classes in the next academic year.
Well, they are lucky.
They are indeed. Professor Ryder, drawing from obviously your incredible experience in having done this for not only so long, but also having taught so many students coming from all over the world, I think the last question we're going to be looking at today is, in terms of anyone stepping into this world of academic research, or particularly looking at financial crime, given the post-COVID era, given the rapid digitalization of the modern world, and the ever-evolving nature of money laundering and financial crimes in general, what do you think students should be looking at? What do you think academics should be looking at in terms of what could be the next frontier for research?
Yeah, good question. I think that it's whatever interests you. I don't think you can identify and rule out particular areas. Who would have thought, 15 years ago, I should be looking at terrorism financing? No. And the next project will be, for example, exchange of information and GDPR. Who would have thought I'd be looking at human rights from a topic? So it's something I've read about and written a little bit, but never really I've engaged with it. So I think you just got to look at your interests in the area, but look for that intriguing current issue. I think in terms of moving forward, I think within the UK, corporate economic crime is going to be particularly important over the next 12 months with the Law Commission review. I think the implications of tax fraud with the pandemic will be very interesting. And I think it will be intriguing to see, as a third topic, what the current government does in relation to its economic crime plan that they published in 2019, and see how many of those targets have been reached. I'm skeptical of the government's commitment to financial crime in the UK. The rhetoric suggests they are very committed, but again, you talk to scholars, you talk to legal practitioners, and there is a sense of apathy and frustration towards the government. So I think really that, for me personally, they'd be the ones I'll be looking at the next sort of 12 to 18 months.
Well, Professor Ryder, thank you very much for your time today. And if you were, just to end this off, if you were going to have one piece of advice for academics, practitioners coming onto the field, young in their careers, what would it be?
Oh God, yeah. I think it's just enjoy it. I think that there's going to be times where people are going to be teaching things that maybe they're not comfortable with. but your expertise will be identified. You know, I think, if it's contract law, international trade, equity interests, and I think if you can feed in your passion for your research into the teaching, it makes a massive difference. And I remember one brief example. I'd given a talk to NATO in Ankara in 2018, and that was on the Tuesday morning. And I flew back to London, back in class at 9 the next morning, presenting those findings. And the buzz you get from students going, "My God, he did that," and other colleagues have done it. And it's that realization that what your tutor is giving to students is actually, well, you know, they presented that to, you know, the colleagues like Jonah Razak, who's presented to the United Nations, and Noel Quenevere, who's provided training to services personnel. And I don't think you can get any more realistic than if an academic has presented their findings, engaged with X, Y, and Z stakeholders. This makes it real for the students.
I mean, it is inspirational whenever you know, you hear stories like that. And obviously, it was. I remember being in your class. I remember being absolutely taken aback whenever we had the opportunity to engage. It was always fun. I remember a lot of my friends were in your LLM class at the time as well, and honest to God, it was just a brilliant experience.
Quite motivating, actually.
Really grateful. Yeah. And I mean, Professor Ryder always had a very fun approach to class. He'd come in and kind of have more of a conversation with us. So again, thank you for having a similar conversation here today with us at Mazel Tov. We are deeply appreciative of your time and for the enormous amount of help that you provide on a regular basis with your guidance. So thank you.
So much.
And
My
the
pleasure.
recording.
Yeah.